Hey everyone, I'm Dan Sege from Hydro Ottawa, and I'll be hosting the ThinkEnergy podcast. So here's today's big question. Are you looking to better understand the fast-changing world of energy? Join me every 2 weeks and get a unique perspective from industry leaders as we deep dive and discuss some of the coolest trends, emerging technologies, and latest innovations that drive the energy sector. So stay tuned as we explore some traditional and some quirky facets of this industry. This is the ThinkEnergy podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. On today's show, we're going to talk about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees, literally. Did you know that across North America, the populations of monarch butterflies, bees, and other pollinators are in a steep decline due to herbicides, pesticides, climate change, and a reduction in natural pollinator habitats? Pollinators are responsible for a third of the world's food supply, so they are extremely vital to our existence. In Canada, there are more than 1,000 species of pollinating animals that are responsible for billions of dollars worth of Canadian farm produce, flowers, and ecosystems that rely on pollination. In short, without pollinators, food supply would suffer drastically. It may seem like an unlikely union, but utilities like Hydro Ottawa are ideally suited to restore these environments thanks to a number of utility corridors and properties in their service territories, not to mention the kilometers of power lines and right-of-ways along roadsides. Moreover, vegetation along utility corridors are compatible with these types of vegetation necessary to support pollinators. In 2019, Hydro Ottawa began civil construction of its largest ever municipal transformer station in the south end of Ottawa, situated on 24 acres of land. Since the new transformer station requires only 5 acres of property, Hydro Ottawa partnered with the City of Ottawa, Rideau Valley Conservation Authority, and the Canadian Wildlife Federation to create one of the largest pollinator meadows of its kind in eastern Ontario. Adjacent to this future station, the agreement means that 15 acres will be dedicated to a pollinator meadow, which is scheduled for seeding in the spring of 2021. A 4-acre tree reforestation area was reforested in 2020 with 2,750 trees, thanks to the Rideau River Conservation Authority. So here is today's big question. What goes into a successful pollinator meadow, and how can we, as an industry and as ordinary citizens, help the movement by building more pollinator meadows, maybe in our own backyards? I have 2 guests joining me today for this podcast. My first guest is Tracey Etwell, a restoration ecologist with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. Tracey supports the Right-of-Way program, which helps restore pollinator meadows for monarch butterflies and other pollinators in eastern Ontario. My second guest is Meaghan McDonald, Lake Planning and Shoreline Stewardship Coordinator for the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority. There are 36 conservation authorities in Ontario responsible for furthering the restoration, development, and management of watershed and their natural resources across the province. Thank you both for joining me today. So Tracey, let's start with the Canadian Wildlife Federation. What are pollinators? What important role do pollinators play, and what does pollinator habitat look like?
Great question, Dan. So as a group, there are many species that are pollinators. Many people aren't aware there's things like native bees, flies, moths, butterflies, beetles, and even our hummingbirds are pollinators. But when we talk about our pollinator habitat in our project, we're really focusing on the insects, such as our native bees, flies, and butterflies. And pollinator habitat varies depending on each species, but all insect pollinators benefit from open meadows full of wildflowers and grasses. And these native flowers provide the pollen and the nectar and the vegetation in general for the species to hide, nest, and overwinter. And also, some of these flowers are very specific hosts for butterflies and moths, where they require that specific plant for their life cycle.
Now, this question is for both. Do habitats vary depending on where they're located in the province and country? If so, what's unique about Eastern Ontario? Wondering, Meaghan, if you can expand on this. And then what about you, Tracey?
Yeah, sure. So obviously our country is massive. So there's a big variety of habitats. We've got mountains, prairies, plains, forests, wetlands, all sorts of things. I think what's kind of unique about Eastern Ontario, maybe in comparison to our southern counterpart there, is that we do have still quite a lot of natural areas available to us. The development pressures out here are building just as they are in the southern region, but I think in Eastern Ontario, there's a really good opportunity to sort of preserve what we already have and protect the resources that we already have as that development occurs. So I think that's kind of a unique feature out here.
So our focus on Eastern Ontario is based on two things. One is that the threatened monarch butterfly range in Canada is heavily focused in Ontario and Quebec. So obviously we're overlapping that region. And secondly, our funder, which is the Ontario Trillium Foundation, has sponsored our work in the Eastern Ontario region. There are also tons and tons of rights of way here, which we define as roadways, transmission lines, and pipelines. And as Meaghan said, we do have habitat across Canada, and the management of this vegetation along rights of way is compatible with meadow habitat, which benefits these pollinators. And we're hoping that rights of way meadow projects will catch on across Canada. And we're busy creating a national network of rights of way managers to encourage meadow habitat restoration across the country.
Okay, Tracey, I know that there are many factors that are contributing to the decline in pollinators and their habitats. Based on your experience, what are those reasons? And is there one in particular that's been identified as the most destructive force?
Yeah, so you're correct. There are many forces that contribute to this. The biggest one is thought to be the loss of habitat, which is consistent with a lot of species. When land is developed, the habitat is lost. Also, these insects need large corridors of habitat to travel around. So when these pieces get disconnected, it's harder for these pollinators to find that habitat. Also in Eastern Ontario, the invasive plant species wild parsnip, which some people may be aware of, is another threat. It's spread rapidly throughout the area and is outcompeting our native wildflowers. It's hard to control. In many places, they spray and frequent mowing are the ways they control it. So when it's then controlled, then those native species that would have been there are now removed. So we're hoping once wild parsnip can be under control, better meadow habitat restoration can support these populations.
Back to you, Meaghan. Can you tell us about the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority and what types of stewardship projects you're involved with?
Sure. So in partnership with our foundation branch, the Rideau Valley Conservation Foundation, we offer a number of stewardship programs that are really aimed at largely private landowners, but also municipalities and public landowners as well. Our main one would really be our afforestation tree planting program. We plant about 200,000 trees just in the Rideau watershed alone every year. We also have a shoreline naturalization program, which helps a lot of shoreline landowners create sort of a natural buffer along their waterways. We have a lot of lakes and rivers in our watershed that we're fortunate to have, so we like to help landowners protect what they have on their property. We also have a rural clean water grant program, which is aimed at helping farmers do clean water projects on their property. And in addition to that, we also do some stream monitoring, wetland restoration, invasive species removal, and garbage cleanups, especially in the city of Ottawa with our City Stream Watch program.
With respect to Pollinator Meadows, Meaghan, what can you tell us about your organization's role? Do you bring a regional expertise about Eastern Ontario's environment and its native plants?
Yeah, so we don't have a huge focus on pollinators in our organization. We've historically been a lot more focused on water quality protection projects, which is why it's so important for us to have partners like the Canadian Wildlife Federation to partner with on projects like this. So we don't have a major role in the pollinator project realm. Where we do bring our regional expertise is more for tree planting, shoreline naturalization, so your trees and your shrubs, and items like that through our stewardship programs. We also partner with our nursery. Our nursery supplier is the Ferguson Tree Nursery, which is located down in Kemptville. And they've been working lately with us and a few other groups in the Ottawa Valley on expanding their product line away from just trees so that they also can be a source of native pollinator species as well in Eastern Ontario. Right now, it's really aimed at potted plants for landowners if they want to, create a little pollinator habitat in their own property. But they are looking at expanding that so that they can be a local source for native seed as well. It's very important that we kind of keep that local seed source in the area because when you're bringing in plants from different regions, they're sometimes not quite as adapted to our current climate conditions as say, Southern Ontario or other parts of the country. Really, the Canadian Wildlife Federation is kind of the expert on this project that we're working with, and we're very happy to have their expertise on board.
You both are playing integral parts in the 15-acre Pollinator Meadows that Hydro Ottawa is building in the south end of the city. I understand it's one of the largest in Eastern Ontario. Tracey, why are utilities a key player in Canadian Wildlife Federation's pollinator recovery efforts?
So CWF is very excited to be partnering with Hydro Ottawa and RVCA on this initiative, which is one of the largest projects, as you mentioned. So utilities are a key player in our pollinator restoration efforts as they maintain over 160,000 kilometers of transmission lines, thousands of generation stations across Canada, which has huge potential for pollinator habitat restoration. Also, their linear design are relatively easy for pollinators to find. Since utilities need to control the woody species over the long term along these facilities, it provides a great place for the wildflowers and grasses to grow. And it provides a great opportunity for utilities to just demonstrate environmental leadership and provide the habitat. Thus, it's a win-win for the utilities and the pollinators.
And now for you, Meaghan. What kind of follow-up work does Rideau Valley Conservation Authority do for a project like Hydro's 15-acre pollinator meadow?
Yeah, so for this project, we're actually already going to be on site for a related tree planting project. So it's kind of why we are involved in the pollinator side, because it does take a little bit of work to establish native pollinator seed. Many of the native seeds, for example, they might take 1, 2, maybe more years to germinate, and really a few years before they really establish and take over. So it's really important that we manage that area for invasive species so that they don't take over, or that an opportunistic species like Tracey mentioned, poison parsnip, for example, or Manitoba maple seedlings, that they don't move in. So this will be done really through annual to semi-annual mowing of the site. So we wait until the right time to sort of do a mow so that we can remove some of the unwanted species, allowing the native ones to really come up. We'll probably also do a little bit of spot removal of the undesirable plants as they come up as well. And we'll do some monitoring as well, plots throughout the meadow that'll let us sort of measure how well the native plants are really coming along and at what rates. Which will be great because it will be a great learning experience for us since we don't personally have a lot of experience. It'll just kind of be a great way to see what works and what doesn't and what goes into a project like this so that hopefully we can be involved with more in the future.
The Rideau Valley Conservation Authority has also planted 2,750 trees on 4 acres at this site. Meaghan, is the reforestation connected to the meadow, or is it a separate but complementary initiative?
Yeah, I think it's kind of both. It is on the same site. The trees were planted last spring, and they kind of form a little bit of a barrier around the outside area of the pollinator garden, or the pollinator meadow. So it does create a nice barrier between the meadow and the adjacent highway and adjacent farm field. So it's going to create a nice little windbreak. It'll also help with some of the salt spray that's coming off the highway. And these trees were really planted as part of the compensation for the station that's being built there. And we found that having the combination of the trees as the compensation and also the opportunity for the pollinator habitat was just such a great opportunity at this particular site. Just because we don't really want to get trees planted too close to the station, especially with the tornado that came through a few years ago. So it's nice to have those trees at a distance, but also have that nice low growing, easy to maintain pollinator meadow in the areas directly surrounding it. So it's a nice combination there.
Now, understanding that without pollinators, Canada's food supply is threatened. Tracey, how is the Canadian Wildlife Federation building resources and support for these projects?
Yes, so the Canadian Wildlife Federation is committed to supporting pollinators for both our biodiversity and our food supply. As you mentioned, many of the nutritious plants we eat, such as fruits and vegetables, rely on insect pollination, and 90% of the world's flowering plants rely on insect pollination. So it's critical that as a global society, we support these insect pollinators. Now, our project is focused on a variety of supports, such as technical expertise in building these meadows, increasing the native seed supply in Ontario, and providing case studies of the costs and benefits of restoring meadow habitat. We work with interested managers to develop their respective projects, and we've also recently formed the Canadian branch of Rights of Way within the US Rights of Way Habitat Working Group to enhance our network so that we have more access to resources, case studies, and best practices.
I'm really looking forward to your thoughts on this next question. Tracey, road right-of-ways are a major push for Canadian Wildlife Federation's pollinator initiative. Why build them there?
Yeah, so like transmission lines, road rights of way are another area of great potential for habitat. If you think about the over 1 million kilometers of roads across Canada, that's a lot of space for pollinator habitat. There's also a lot of interest in reducing the mowing and the herbicide use that goes into maintaining roads. And by using native plants, that can allow for that reduction in those two aspects. And it may even save municipalities maintenance costs by reducing these efforts. And also, it's a great opportunity to share the initiative with the public that are driving by and can see these beautiful displays.
Now for my last question for both of you. How can landowners improve pollinator habitats on their properties? And what can citizens do to support this work or our pollinator friends in general? Meaghan, let's start with you and the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority.
Sure. So we always promote the use of native plants on properties for a number of reasons. They obviously have benefits to pollinators, but they also are often like more low maintenance than your typical ornamental plants. So we would encourage folks that are gardening or looking for something to plant on their property to maybe consider some of our native plant species, just because they do have that added benefit to the pollinators. We would also, of course, promote the use of native plants along natural areas like shorelines. In addition to sort of the wildflowers and the meadow species that we're using in this project, there's lots of native trees and shrubs as well that they could consider that are beneficial to pollinators. I was just going to say, and then supporting your local native nurseries. There's a few in the Ottawa Valley that people can consider, and sometimes it just takes a little bit more searching and digging to find those native plants for your garden, but they're out there, and if we all support our local native nurseries, then they'll be able to continue supplying those plants for us.
And now, Tracey, what about from a Canadian Wildlife Federation perspective?
Right, so we also support backyard gardens planted with native plants. It's a great start. We offer many webinars and guides online to help people get into this mode of planting. Some other things that people can do that they might not have considered is leaving leaves on your lawn and garden in the fall. Many of these pollinators actually overwinter, and they'll use that habitat to protect themselves from the winter conditions. Lastly, if you can resist mowing those dandelions until more spring flowers bloom, that's one of the first floral resources that are available for pollinators. And the spring is actually one of the hardest seasons for them to get going because there's very little for them to feed on, and they're very hungry, obviously. So something else you can also do is overseed with clover in your garden, and clover is a great resource for pollinators. In terms of bigger things, you can contact your local councils and ask them to become a bee city, which is a specific designation, which means they support pollinators and you have projects that support that. And also contact your municipality and ask them if they can support meadow habitat restoration projects in their area.
Okay, Tracey and Meaghan, are you ready to close us off with some rapid fire questions? We'll start with Tracey and then we'll follow up with Meaghan.
Sure.
Sounds good.
What is your favorite pollinator?
My favorite pollinator is the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, which is an endangered bumblebee with a great name.
I was just going to say our native bees. There's many species, and I think they're all important. So I don't have quite a specific answer, but native bees.
Now, what is your favorite flower?
My favorite is the brown-eyed Susan, which is a native plant, of course, a powerhouse for pollinators and very easy to grow.
I like wild bergamot. It's, again, easy to grow, and it's got a really cool kind of purple flower on it.
Moving on. What is one thing you can't live without?
Chocolate. Always chocolate.
And I would say coffee.
What habit or hobby have you picked up during shelter in place?
For me, it's been sourdough baking, making my own.
And I've been starting a lot of craft projects and not finishing them. We also got a canoe last year and new cross-country skis this winter.
Okay. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
For me, it would be to fly, to travel and see the world.
Also to fly. Can't beat that.
This is an interesting one. If you could turn back time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you be telling her?
I would tell her to enjoy life more and not to be so serious.
I'd say same, and also travel and spend time with friends and family as much as you can while you can.
Okay. What excites you most about these pollinator projects?
I get excited to see the new life emerge. So when new plants start to bloom, when the insects start to come in and use that habitat, that just fills me with joy.
And I'm excited about kind of learning something new because these projects are new for us, and being able to bring some of that knowledge to our landowners and then also to some of our conservation areas as well.
And lastly, what do you currently find most interesting in your sector?
For me, I would say it's the new application of new technologies that are coming online that help us support the conservation projects, answering specific questions that we need help with.
And I really like working with landowners and sort of seeing them connect the dots on how what they do on their property really impacts nature, and it's always fun to see.
Well, Tracey, Meaghan, we've reached the end of another episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. I truly hope you had a lot of fun, and thank you so much for joining me today. Cheers.
It's been great. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. It has been.
Thank you for joining us today. I truly hope you enjoyed this episode of the ThinkEnergy podcast. For past episodes, make sure you visit our website, hydroottawa.com/podcasts. Lastly, if you found value in this podcast, be sure to subscribe. Anyway, this podcast is a wrap. Cheers, everyone.